Hey guys, so I'm only going to do one lecture just on the basic anatomy of the urinary system, and this is in complement to our chapter 24 about fluid balance. So the urinary system functions to rid the body of waste products and plays a huge role in maintaining homeostasis. So remember we talked about with the previous lectures, that would be fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance. The kidneys also play very important roles in maintaining blood volume, pressure, and blood composition. And as we know, probably, the urinary system is pretty closely associated with the reproductive system, and together these are called the urogenital system. And this is because of shared embryonic development, as well as the adult anatomical relationship of these structures. But this lecture and this focus will only be on the urinary side of the urogenital system. So we'll talk about the functions of the urinary system first. So this is our urinary system, and you're expected to know the renal artery and vein, which you should have known from our previous lectures and the blood vessel quiz, as well as the kidneys, which are located right here. These then connect to the ureter, which go to the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. So it's pretty simple anatomically, but physiologically, they're pretty complex. So the functions of the kidneys are they're pretty important. So the functions are to filter blood and to excrete toxic metabolic wastes from the body, to regulate blood volume, pressure, and osmolarity, to regulate electrolytes and the acid-base balance, as well as secreting erythropoietin, which stimulates erythropoiesis or the production of red blood cells. They also help regulate calcium levels by participating in calcitriol or vitamin D synthesis. They also can help clear hormones from blood, and in times of starvation, they actually can synthesize glucose from amino acids. So these are pretty darn important. So we said that they eliminate nitrogenous wastes. And nitrogenous wastes come in four main forms in humans. And these is ammonia, urea, uric acid, and creatinine. So all nitrogenous wastes are formed from the metabolism of proteins. But not all of the protein metabolism comes from dietary proteins, but also the breakdown of tissues. So you could have an increase in creatinine even if you're not ingesting very much protein, and that could be that's one of the landmark diagnostic tools of certain conditions like rhabdomyolysis and things like that. So these nitrogenous wastes are because of metabolic waste. So waste is any substance that's useless to the body or present in excess of the body's needs. So the body just doesn't need this. So metabolic waste is waste substance that's produced by the body. So with nitrogenous waste, you have blood urea nitrogen, which is the level of nitrogenous waste that's within blood. If you have an increase in BUN, you can have azotemia, which could indicate renal insufficiency. And this could be, this is associated with different diseases or different states like rhabdomyolysis. There's also uremia, which is a syndrome of diarrhea, vomiting, dyspnea, and cardiac arrhythmias that stem from toxicity or having the toxicity of nitrogenous waste. So the treatment of uremia is hemodialysis or organ transplants. So you'll often see this with different syndromes. So there's different syndromes like hemolytic uremic syndrome, and usually you'll see uremic. And this again is indicated. This indicates that there's a toxicity of nitrogenous waste. So excretion is when you separate waste from the body fluids and you eliminate them. So you should know by now the difference between excretion and secretion. And there are four different body systems that carry out excretion. And these are respiratory system, integumentary system, the digestive system, and the urinary system, which excretes metabolic wastes, toxins, drugs, hormones, salts, hydrogen, and water. So we'll also talk about the anatomy of the kidney pretty quickly. So the kidneys lie against the posterior abdominal wall at the level of T12 to L3. So remember, those are the vertebra. So that's the thoracic, the 12th thoracic vertebra to the third lumbar vertebra. So the right kidney is a little bit lower than the left because of the right lobe of the liver. So it accommodates that. And then your 12th rib crosses the middle of the left kidney in most people. Kidneys are described as being retroperitoneal, as well as the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the renal arteries and veins, and the adrenal glands. And remember, the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney. So the surface, the lateral, meaning the outside, or meaning the furthest from midline, surface is convex, and the medial is concave and has a slit that's called the hilum. And the hilum functions to receive renal nerves, blood vessels, lymphatics, and the ureter. So here we have the gross anatomy of the kidney with the lateral surface, the medial surface, and the slit for the hilum would be about right here. And this is where it receives renal artery, renal vein, and the ureter, which is located here. So the hilum. Okay, we'll come back to this in a second. So there are 3 protective connective tissue coverings on the kidney. So first you have the renal fascia, which is just deep to the parietal peritoneum, so the peritoneal, that peritoneal lining, so it's just outside of that. So that's the outermost covering is the renal fascia. And this binds the kidney to the abdominal wall. You then have the perirenal fat capsule that cushions the kidney and holds it into place. So as you can imagine what we just said about the 12th rib crossing the kidney, and that 12th rib is a floating rib, the kidney is pretty prone to damage. So I don't know if you've ever known anybody who's had like a ruptured kidney or been kicked in the kidneys. That's really bad. So the deepest most is the fibrous capsule that encloses the kidney and protects that from trauma and infection. This is made up of collagen fibers that extend from the fibrous capsule all the way to the renal fascia. And this allows the kidneys to move a little bit when you change positions, but not too much, because of course you don't want your kidneys floating around in there. So there's 2 main zones of the kidney that form urine. There's the outer renal cortex and the inner renal medulla. Remember, we've heard this cortex versus medulla before when talking about like the adrenal glands. So anytime you see cortex, that's going to be the outer part, and the medulla is the inside medial part, like this. Okay? So we've got that outer renal cortex, and then we have the inner renal medulla. And there are renal columns, which are extensions of the cortex that project inward, and there are renal pyramids. There's about 6 to 10 depending on how large your kidneys are. And one lobe of a kidney is one pyramid and its overlying cortex. So here, that would be the cortex here, the pyramids, here you have the base with the apex there, and one lobe would be a pyramid plus the cortex. And here you see the renal column, which is the bits of cortex between the pyramids. There's also the minor calyx, which is a cup that nestles the papilla of each pyramid and collects the urine. There are major calyces, which is the plural of calyx, and this is formed by joining the minor calyces. From there, there's the renal pelvis, which is formed by joining major calyces. And then there's the ureter, which is a continuation of the pelvis that drains urine down into the urinary bladder. So here we have the minor calyx. So you have the pyramid draining into the minor calyx. These several minor calyces join to form a major calyx. And these all join to form the renal pelvis, which then becomes the ureter. So from the ureter, the distal portion of the ureter would connect to the urinary bladder. So the kidneys are only a tiny bit of body weight, but receive about 21% of cardiac output. So the renal artery divides into segmental arteries that branch into different arteries throughout the kidney. So they branch into afferent arterioles with one supplying per each nephron. And this leads to a ball of capillaries, which is called the glomerulus. Blood is drained from the glomerulus by efferent arterioles. Definitely remember the difference between afferent, which means going towards, and efferent means coming from. And the way that I remember these are the difference between affect and effect. But if you don't know those differences, then that's probably not going to help you very much. So the renal vein then empties into the inferior vena cava where it returns to the heart. We will end here and we'll talk about the nephron, but I would very, very, very strongly recommend reading up on the nephron because nephron physiology is pretty hard and will take a little bit for you guys, and even honestly when I was learning it, took a little bit for me to learn. So we will continue with that during our next class meeting.